World War II was over, but bombs and bullets still flew in anger on American soil in 1946. An escape attempt gone wrong on the famous island would leave 5 dead and many more wounded. This is the Battle of Alcatraz. Alcatraz, or The Rock, no, not that one, is an island off the coast of San Francisco, California. The site was originally a fort built in the 1850s to protect the nearby city in the wake of the Mexican-American War. In 1912, what would later become the prison's main building was constructed and used as a United States military prison. It was only in 1934, after modernization efforts, that the Federal Bureau of Prisons would open Alcatraz as a maximum security federal prison in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz Island was an ideal place for such a facility, being surrounded by cold waters, fast currents, razor-sharp rocks, and on occasion, sharks. This, combined with lawmakers' belief that it was the strongest prison in America, meant the prison was quickly dubbed inescapable. This didn't stop inmates from trying. Bernard Paul Coy had turned to crime during the Great Depression. He was serving a 26-year prison sentence on the island for robbing a bank with a sawn-off shotgun. While in prison, Coy was assigned the role of cellhouse orderly, giving him freedoms the other prisoners did not have. He used this freedom to carefully study the routines of guards, as well as identify security flaws in the block. After some time, Coy realized a flaw was present in the west end of the cell house. The gun gallery that ran above the cells where armed guards would patrol was only protected by bars, lacking supporting mesh or barriers. If Coy could pry the bars apart, he would be able to reach the armed guards. Joining his escape attempt would be Marvin Hubbard, Joseph Kretzer, and Clarence Carnes, the last of which is notable for being the youngest inmate ever to serve time in Alcatraz. Together, the four created a plan. First, while the other inmates were working and the armed guards weren't present, they would assault the attending officer. Next, Coy would enter the gun gallery through the bars and overpower the armed guard when he returned. Finally, using their newly acquired weapons, the party would force their way to the prison's launch, where a boat docked daily, and use their hostages to secure safe passage. It's unclear where the group had hoped to progress after this point, and the plan was decidedly risky. Nonetheless, it was set into motion on May 2nd, 1946. Coy swept the floors of the cell house as Hubbard called for Officer William Miller to help him. While Hubbard was being frisked, Coy struck, attacking the unsuspecting officer and quickly overpowering him. Using Miller's keys, Kretzer and Carnes were both released from their cells. Coy, who had been starving himself for some time to fit through the bars, now smeared himself in axle grease and began to climb to the gun gallery. Once at the top, he began to spread the bars using a crude spreader made from toilet fixtures in the prison workshop. This doubled the gap in the bars to 10 inches, and Coy painfully slipped through the tight gap. He quickly grabbed a riot club and waited for the return of armed guard Bert Birch. Birch was caught by surprise, not expecting an inmate to be able to reach the gun gallery. Coy brutally clubbed the officer to the ground and then proceeded to strangle him until he was unconscious. From Birch, the group were able to collect keys, a Springfield rifle and a 1911 pistol, as well as clubs and a gas grenade. About a dozen more convicts were released by the group, but only 2, Shockley and Thompson, joined the escape attempt, with the rest wisely returning to their cells. The officers were placed in a cell to keep them out of the way. The plan had gone perfectly so far. All the group needed now was the key to the yard door, which would have allowed them to escape and reach the launch. Luckily for them, against regulation, Miller held a yard door key to make running of the prison smoother. Unfortunately, Miller knew the value of the key and was able to hide it from the group, placing it into a toilet of the cell he was being kept in. Panic began to set in with the group, and the inmates tried to force all of the keys they did possess into the door. Unsurprisingly, this did little to help. When the inmates did eventually find the yard door key, they had managed to jam the lock, trapping them inside the cell block and dashing any remaining hope for the group. They were stuck. More officers entered the cell house on routine patrol to check for their missing colleagues, with each being captured, raising the total number of hostages to 9. A decision was made by inmates to change tactics and try to shoot their way out. At 2:35, Coy fired his rifle at officers in the neighbouring watchtowers, wounding one. Not long after, the sirens of Alcatraz sounded across the bay, alerting the grave danger present. The sound could be easily heard by the residents of San Francisco and the passengers crossing the Golden Gate Bridge. Everybody knew something big was happening on the Rock. Egged on by his fellow inmates, Kretzer took the pistol he was using and shot the captured, defenseless officers. His intention was to try and prevent the group from testifying against them in the future, though I don't see how them testifying would be worse than murder charges. 5 were wounded, with Bill Miller being the only fatality. Despite this very present danger, a brave officer, Ernest Ludgeson, was able to discreetly write down the names of everyone involved in the escape attempt on the wall, circling the ringleaders. He feared all the officers would be killed. Carnes, Shockley and Thompson all succumbed to their despair and returned to their cells. The rest, however, were determined. They would leave this island, dead or alive. Law enforcement hadn't anticipated this determination and hoped retaking the cell house would be relatively easy. At 6 p.m, a squad of armed officers entered the building in an attempt to gain control, but were quickly beaten back. 4 officers were injured, and one, Harold Stites, was killed by friendly fire while providing assistance to another officer. Officials then cut the power, plunging the cell house into darkness as they reconsidered their options. Warden James A. Johnston saw his situation was dire and telegrammed for assistance from the nearby naval station, Treasure Island. 2 platoons of Marines were dispatched to assist. Inmates that were in the prison workshops at the time of the takeover were assembled in the recreation yard and given bedding to use until the situation was resolved. After nightfall, 2 squads of unarmed officers entered the cell house, covered by the darkness. It was a long-standing rule in Alcatraz that firearms weren't permitted in the cell house, and it was decided, to prevent the risk of further injury, the officers would be unarmed. They would instead be covered by officers in the gun galleries overhead. They quickly located the trapped officers and escorted them to safety. Believing that the would-be escapees were holed up in cell block D, the Marines unleashed a bombardment of mortar and machine gun fire into the building, carving great gashes into the concrete structure. Damage to the plumbing caused significant flooding in the cell block. At this point, Robert Stroud, or the Birdman of Alcatraz, the most famous inmate to serve in the facility, made an effort to end the battle. Stroud was 56 at this point, but this didn't stop him from climbing over the railing onto the floor of the D block to investigate. He discovered those involved in the escape attempt weren't there and made it clear to officers that the continued barrage would cause many innocent men to die. The bombardment ceased. A change of plan was needed. The Marines instead decided to use skills they had learned in the Pacific Theater against the entrenched Japanese. Holes were drilled into the prison roof to allow grenades to be dropped inside, forcing the movements of inmates and allowing them to be cornered. Midday the next day, Kretzer phoned the warden and tried to negotiate a deal. Johnston made it clear they would only accept their complete surrender, to which Kretzer responded he'd never be taken alive. The siege continued after nightfall, with officers periodically firing into the building, shaking up the already rattled group. The following morning, squads of armed officers periodically rushed the cell house, quickly gaining ground. At 9:40 a.m. on May the 4th, the bodies of Kretzer, Coy and Hubbard were found, struck down by bullets and shrapnel. The Battle of Alcatraz, after nearly 48 hours of constant gunfire, was over. Before the attack, Hubbard was taking legal action, claiming his confession had been beaten out of him. Hospital records were present to back up this claim, and lawyers stated that he would have had a fair chance of being released if he had not been killed in the siege. Thompson and Shockley were both executed simultaneously in a gas chamber 2 years later for their roles in the battle. Carnes, now the only surviving member of the group, was given an additional life sentence. He would die in 1988 in a prison from complications from AIDS. Blame for the attack was placed on the 2 guards that had been overcome initially, as well as Warden Johnston. He would be replaced in 1948. Months would pass in the prison before any sort of normality resumed. Repairs and improvements ensured that there would be no more escape attempts from the island until Floyd Wilson's attempt in 1956. However, the scars of the battle still remained throughout the prison, a dire warning to the next prisoner to try their luck escaping the rock. I've been the Peculiar Possum, and thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends, and I'll see you in the next video.